You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs. Welcome back. I've got Katja with me here, and we are going to talk all about stretching, one of the most confusing areas of research, because you can basically find studies to probably support almost any theory out there. And they're not always great quality. They're, of course, like any research topic, of varying quality. And there's a lot of things that have gone in and out of style in the stretching realm. I know, there was a time when stretching was really popular, and I feel like it really kind of went out of style not too long ago. And it feels like it's coming back in style now, although I think there's a lot of myths and misconceptions. And of course, as you'll see on our episode today, a lot that we still don't know about stretching. So we're going to give you kind of a big picture overview of the research on stretching, and a lot of which are actually reviews, which is kind of the gold standard in research, which means that looking at a lot of different studies to get some big picture takeaways, to give you some information that might be helpful to you. Know that there's a lot of information on this topic. Maybe we'll come back to it in a more specific realm later on and look at different parts of this. I'm sure we could. But for now, what we want to do is do a quick big picture overview. We're going to talk about different types of stretching. We're going to talk about using stretching before or after exercise or yoga. We're going to talk a little bit about what's stretching. We're going to talk about the nervous system and stretching. And then we'll talk a little bit about myofascial release, just as it relates to stretching and range of motion specifically, because that's a lot longer topic that I'm sure we'll talk on more later on the podcast. And then we'll go over some takeaways at the end too, which I think is really helpful. But let's go ahead and kind of dive in to some of the types of stretching too, and anything else that you think is important to mention before we begin, Katja.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this topic. As you've already mentioned, there are so many aspects to stretching, and so much has evolved in the stretching literature, and really never gets boring because we constantly keep learning about this. That also makes it confusing, as you've mentioned sometimes, but to get started and to get some structure into our heads so that we can make sense of the research, I think it's important to just classify or describe what types of stretching there are out there. So oftentimes what we can find in yoga, obviously, and most of you will know, is static stretching. So we can either do that passively or we can do that actively. So say you want to stretch your chest area, you may want to engage the muscles on your backside to, as we sometimes say, open up the chest. And that would be an active static stretch when you use the antagonist muscles on the, for instance, here in the back in that example. And you can do that passively when you just, for instance, in yin yoga, let's say, you hold a pose and you do not contract any other muscles actively, you just stretch passively there. That's one major group of stretching, and that is quite well researched, or we find a lot of research on this. We also have dynamic, or we also call it sometimes ballistic stretching, where we use bounces or bouncy movements. They're a bit more dynamic. It's one of the types of stretching that have gone out of vogue for a little while, but definitely is back. So all those ballistic stretches, dynamic stretches, especially in sports, for instance, as warm-up, you can find those when you watch a sports game and you look at the athletes on the sidelines warming up, you may encounter those as well, but also in the yoga practice. And then we have, for instance, PNF stretching, which is proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. And there you do a combination of things. You contract the muscle first, and then you stretch it passively typically. So those are some of the major types of stretching. If you look into the literature, there are a ton of names for all of these different things, and they too keep evolving. So if after this episode you take a book and you want to look up what we were talking about, chances are at least semi-high that you find other words for those things. But I think that's a nice first kind of categorization,
And I
unless you
think
want to add to that. Yeah.
I think it's all important to consider the details of all of these are very different from study to study. If you're not digging into the details of the study, it can be a pretty broad spectrum. Like static stretching, for instance, may or may not be totally passive, or maybe they're not focusing on that. Are people really relaxing like we would in a yin practice? Is it yin practice? Is it something that's really comparable, or are they just asking to hold a position, which maybe they'll be relaxing, maybe not. Maybe they're holding it. And, in a non-yin setting and in more of a hatha or vinyasa practice, we're actually usually engaging muscles to kind of hold ourselves in maybe Paschimottanasana with the legs out in front on the floor, a seated forward fold. You might be asking your students to internally rotate the thighs or contract the thighs, the quadriceps. So there's a lot of variance on this. And I think that's probably part of why we see so much variance in the research. And usually a good study will tell you the details of that, or maybe the lack of details given to the participants in the study, which gives a lot of moving parts to just some simple components of a study that we're looking at to begin with, which is just what are we doing. But I think in general, when I see the word static stretching, I'm assuming that it's usually fairly passive, and that I'm usually comparing it to what I would use in a yin practice as a teacher. Now, of course, you need to dig in to see, but in a yin practice, we're able to stay longer, which has a longer impact, a greater impact. And again, more to come on durations, because I still think the jury is out on exactly how long we need to stay there. But um, some good topics here to look at. The PNF, which I love. I like to think of as kind of resetting the neurologic feedback. So that's the one where you're contracting. I think the easiest way to think of this one is in Baddha Konasana or butterfly, where you would push onto the inner knees or inner thighs there to resist, to actively engage the inner thighs. And then you relax into the stretch as you maybe gently even push down on the knees to relax in. And it's a great way for getting some of that quick change in range of motion. So static, we've got more dynamic, which could also include active or ballistic. And again, there's so many different names for, I think there's such a big press now on active range of motion, which is kind of maybe even a whole nother topic. I don't know, but I think it's interesting because everyone has like a love or hate relationship with stretching. Like there's such, for yoga teachers, this cliche of everyone assuming that yoga is synonymous with stretching. And some people have moved so far away from that they have kind of discontinued it altogether. And then others, of course, are fans of it and love it and find a lot of benefit from it. So anyways, I think it's great to look at the different types and the ways it can show up, which opens a lot of different options.
Yeah. And what you just said, I think, is really important for our field, for our discipline, yoga, too, is that we have started this conversation and that we have started to question things and bring in other elements from other disciplines or from the fitness realm, maybe. And we are exploring all those different types of mobility, not all necessarily maybe termed or flagged stretching, maybe, but the discussion is fully underway to really ask how much stretching is necessary, how much do we really need, but then also at the same time finding that there are benefits to it, and quite surprising ones too, which you may not think upon first sight or first thought, that don't have anything to do with range of motion. And I'm sure we're going to get to talk about this in here or any future episodes as well. So I love that about yoga, that especially in the last couple of years, it seems to me that we have had this discussion and it's in full swing.
And there's so much research around static stretching, which again, to me, you don't see yin yoga research really. and I think you could argue that whether we need that or not, because I think we can draw a lot of implications from just the static stretching research. Of course, there's a lot more to yin yoga that we know. that's happening. But I think what's interesting within the stretching research is that static stretching has been so frowned upon for a while and so afraid of because of, in the athletic world, this idea of performance deficits from it. And yet the static stretching is usually the one that shows the best long-term changes in range of motion. So, as we're looking for that, I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people are familiar with PNF giving those really quick, acute ones, like in butterfly, where you're pushing on your inner thighs, and then all of a sudden you're able to relax and go deeper into it, and it's magical. It's like this magic trick. But, over and over and over, we see, generally speaking, that the static stretching is the best way to accrue long-term range of motion gains when there's deficits, of course. Like, we're not talking about contortionist training or which is usually more of a genetic thing, but I think it's an interesting to keep in mind because it does get a lot of bad press.
Yeah, and as you already said when you did the little introduction, fortunately, we do have a couple of very recent reviews. So, with a quite high level of evidence in the research that takes into account different studies of static stretching, especially also as it relates to the performance bit that you were just mentioning. And we do have many people who come to yoga to look for that increase in range of motion. And we also have athletes who use stretching to increase their range of motion. And for both, obviously, it's interesting to hear and to see that static stretching is not anymore the devil for your performance. However, I have to say, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that in a minute, it really depends also how long you will stretch. And the verdict for now is that there is a certain amount of time that seems to be beneficial or not detrimental to your performance. But there is a ton of research out there with many different ideas about how long one should hold a stretch like this.
Well, and before, and I know where you're heading now, and I just want to plant the seeds here because there was a really big study that actually did give us some good information on how much, how frequent, which was actually pretty groundbreaking in the stretching world and had a pretty big impact for people who look at stretching research, especially in the athletic community. And I think it was kind of part of what helped to bring stretching back into the fold and be more welcomed by athletes, especially because it's been so kind of frowned upon and scared of in the athletic communities. I know I've worked with some professional athletes who have always been really afraid of stretching. It's the one thing as a yoga teacher that I don't push, but usually through our work together, educating and them kind of starting to understand the practices as different tools that can be used in different ways that aren't inherently bad or wrong. Usually they build some relationship to it, but it takes a long time for me, especially with pro athletes, because there is like that very high bar that's set for not wanting to mess with a good thing. And so it is something that has to be kind of worked in, but this was a really big study to kind of start to shift that, I think, in a lot of different realms. So tell us about the takeaways from this. I think it was a review. Was it a meta-analysis too? I can't remember. Do you
You mean the
remember?
one by Thomas, I
Yes.
assume?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think it was a review. And what they did look at was the frequency and volume of stretching throughout 1 week that was beneficial for range of motion. So in that one, we're really looking at range of motion improvements. And that review found that all the types of stretching that they were looking at led to an increase in range of motion. So that's very important to start with. But the biggest increases in range of motion came from static stretching. So that's the first takeaway from that one. And then what's really interesting about that one is the duration that seems to be beneficial for a stretch to be working well in order to increase that range of motion. And I found that really interesting. Their result was that 5 minutes per week was a good amount of time to do stretching in one body region. So 5 minutes was beneficial. And that was more beneficial than doing 10 minutes, for instance, and also proved to be beneficial versus shorter duration. So that 5-minute time frame per body region per week was kind of groundbreaking because it's not really a lot, right? You can incorporate that into your movement regimen or into your practice, into your routine. And the
And
second thing,
ooh,
yeah,
let
yeah,
me just before you go on, I want to keep in mind too that's per body part,
yeah.
right? So keep in mind that that would be depending on how many body areas you were working on.
You're
Yeah.
interested in that sense. Yeah, let's go with the hamstring. So let's say we're primarily focusing of range of motion increase in our hamstring region. And if you do that for 5 minutes 1 week total, that is a good amount of time apparently. And then it doesn't really matter, or it's not as beneficial if you do those 5 minutes in one bout of stretching. So rather than doing your hamstring stretch 1 day a week, 5 minutes, it would be better to split that up and to do at least 5 bouts of stretching a week. So 5 times 1 minute for your hamstrings was the recommendation that they went away with in that review. And I think that's groundbreaking, A, because it's a lot less than I would have thought, and B, because it's really a realistic time frame for people to incorporate, as I already mentioned. So if you feel you're working with an athlete, for instance, or a person who wants to increase their range of motion with respect to the hamstrings, asking them to do 1 minute per day on that area is really doable and is really realistic for people to stick to. And so that really was a highlight there. So frequency over volume. And we actually know that also with regards to other aspects in training, when we talk about athletes, that holds true too. So frequency seemed to be more important than volume, and 5 minutes a week, that's not a lot.
Yeah, and I missed the part you said that 10 minutes didn't seem to have a better. I thought that there were some little improvements if they did more, but the baseline needed to have those was 1 minute 5 times a week. Do you remember?
I think that I would have to
There's
check,
always so many
double
details.
check, but I am quite sure that there were no statistical differences, so significant statistical differences in range of motion improvement between the 5 minutes and the 10 minutes. So it increased range of motion, but not more than the 5 minute increment. So
Hmm.
stretching for 10 minutes didn't lead to more statistically significantly more range of motion
Yeah.
than the 5 minutes proportionally.
What I love about this one is it goes along with everything that we've been saying for a long time. One, frequency over duration. Frequency is so important for whether we're talking about the nervous system or the fascia or the, the brain, which is part of the nervous system, of course. But there's so many systems in the body that really respond to that regularity and that routine, which is so interesting. And then I love that 1 minute can be enough. And I've integrated this into a lot of my yin classes on yoga medicine online. I love doing it at the end of a active day or maybe the day after a really active day to have these really gentle, short duration stretches, which I find to be very powerful. Now, I think there's obviously a lot more to the longer duration stretches in the yin practice that we don't yet understand and I think isn't quite there yet. But I think when we're talking about what's important about this research, which I looked up, it is a review here from 2019, but it was I don't know how to spell it, Chabine and
Mhm.
Bem. Did I say that right? Do you know? Chabine?
I I think so. Let's go
C
with
H
it.
Chaabene. Um, uh, was that what was important was that I was doing it regularly for a minimum of a minute to see changes in range of motion. And I thought, and it's been a while since I've dug into the details of this article, but I thought that they also followed them up a little bit afterwards to see that some of the changes were staying. I don't remember the details of that. Do you by any chance? No. It's a great one to look at. And it's unfortunate nowadays that most of this research isn't free unless you have access to like a university um, research browser there. But I think this is one that is maybe worth purchasing as a yoga teacher. It's called The Acute Effects of Static Stretching on Muscle Strength and Power, an attempt to clarify previous caveats. And you know, this one did come into the arena and say, hey, let's relook at this stretching thing because there is a really important place for it, whether that's in athletes or not. And you know, the important thing here is that regularity. So if we're doing these kind of yin poses, and again, this doesn't tell us, do they need to relax, do they need to be still, is that a minute after they've actually gotten comfortable in it, or is that a minute from start to, you know, tip to tail? So there's a lot more, you know, maybe in there that we can decide what's helpful for us as yoga teachers or as students. We can find what works for us. And obviously we never want to take that away, that empowerment of like what works for you. Maybe you really need 2 or 3 minutes. And maybe that's because it takes you a little longer to get comfortable and relax. These are all questions we don't really know yet in the research, but I think this one holds a nice bar for us to realize that the frequency is more important than the duration when we're talking specifically about long-term ranges of changes in ranges of motion.
Yeah.
So,
And I think what you just said with the longer hold, sometimes it's also, we have to have other things in mind. At the moment, like what we're discussing right now, that's just range of motion. We do know that, for instance, when we want to positively affect wound healing, for instance, that longer stretches are better, but that's a different animal. Right now, we're just talking range of motion. And as you've mentioned, so it's, I think, with respect to the frequency and the durations. There's the two reviews that you just mentioned, and the one by Thomas that really looks at that 5 times 1 minute per week. And the other two that you just mentioned by Beam and Jabin, they also have another very interesting bit when it comes to duration, and that is kind of like a 60-second increment. And that's particularly interesting for people who want to make sure that their performance doesn't suffer from static stretching before exercise or before physical activity. So that was one major takeaway from those two as well, that the 60-second increment or 60-second duration of a static stretch doesn't seem to be really negatively influencing your sports performance. If you do hold a static stretch for longer than that, that would maybe not be as recommendable before exercise. And what we may have to keep in mind, though, is that even for high performance athletes, so for pros, if you've just mentioned before, they may still have to consider if they want to include that static stretch before their sport, because then it's sometimes really just about the nuances. And obviously you need to know the person and the whole system around them and all the aspects when you think about that. But the 60-second increment for someone who's a recreational athlete who's competing, that might be something to keep in mind too when we talk about duration of static stretches. That's interesting.
yeah, and this was another really big one because it started to shed a light on the reality of research and the fear of stretching. And keep in mind that that's so what she's talking about here is less than 60 seconds again per muscle group. So if I did 30 seconds in Paschimottanasana and then I did, you know, another 30 or 40 seconds in another hamstring stretch of some sort, or, you know, we all know Paschimottanasana affects a few different things. It also affects the calves, maybe, depending on where you feel it, or the hips. So again, whatever tissue I'm targeting, I only want to have less than 30 or 60 seconds total cumulative between all of those stretches. So if I do 3 hamstring stretches for 30 seconds each, I've crossed that line. So I think that's an important caveat to keep in there. And that again, what we're talking about here is minimizing effects on performance, which what I love, I think we were talking about this at some point a long time ago, is that um, even in the in the non-athletic population, or the, let's see, weekend athletes or the non-high level athletes, there's a lot of athletes that aren't pro athletes, that don't do it for a living, that don't depend on, you know, making their PR every time they go out. But the changes in performance are actually still pretty small. So for most of us, we don't have to worry too much about the 60 seconds. And I actually think this is an interesting one in a yoga realm because it can propose a little bit of a challenge. For instance, one thing I like to do sometimes in a vinyasa practice is to add in a static stretch and then to challenge the muscles. Maybe you come down and do Janu Shirshasana or a forward fold for 60 or 90 seconds, and then you come up into standing splits. And we all know, you've done this before, you know how challenging it is. And I think it can propose, and we don't really know yet from the research what this is actually doing, but I think it can propose an interesting challenge to the tissues. But as a yoga teacher, I also need to keep in mind that that's going to be a lot harder for them now. You see everyone quivering and dying. Like, I'm not going to leave them there for 2 minutes. Right. So I have to just keep in mind that things are also changing. And if you haven't done this before in a yoga class, experiment with it. It's fun, I think, sometimes to have that challenge and to feel that. I know the type A people in your yoga class will be like, oh, I love that. That was great. It was such a good challenge. And maybe some others won't enjoy it as much, but it's there. It's an offering. So, yeah, the
Yeah,
60 seconds
absolutely.
rule.
That's 60 seconds. And what I want to mention, though, is I've thrown those 60 seconds out there, and we've been discussing it now a little bit like that is set in stone, the 60 seconds. What's really interesting is when you look into the details of those reviews or of those studies, and you will see that, as you just said, we don't know all of these things, because most of the time when you do a static stretch in a study and then you measure things like performance of range of motion, you typically do that like 3 or 5 minutes after the stretching intervention. But in real life, be it for an athlete who does sports competition, there will be more than 3 or 5 minutes between the stretch and the sporting competition. Or in a yoga class, let's say you start out with some static stretches in the beginning, and you are doing that in order to work towards a peak pose, and you are considering all of these things that we just discussed. Well, there will be more than 3 to 5 minutes until you arrive at that one pose that you have been working towards and that you had in mind when you planted that static stretch. So that's where, and I love this, it's really interesting, and it's just so worth to look at the details of the research, because we hear 60 seconds, but then also know that you have to look at how those 60 seconds were measured or performed in the study. And as I just said, that's sometimes a very different setting than the real life scenario. So even though we have been mentioning the 60 seconds as if they were set in stone or God given, they may be not.
We may find out more in 5 or 10 years,
Yeah.
hopefully. And keep in mind too, there's been some interesting looks at how doing that within a full warm up can negate a lot of those performance deficits. So, as an athlete, if I'm doing sports specific warm ups or some cardiovascular warm ups or some dynamic stretching and movements, um, there are, and I think there was a good one about MFR even clearing out some of those performance deficits or neutralizing some of them. Maybe we'll talk about that later. But yeah, in the whole context of things, and I think like Katja said too, is how long is that impairment lasting after the performance impairment, after that static stretching? Am I going right out onto the field? Am I doing this within the context of a full athletic warm up of some sort, which most athletes, especially high caliber athletes, all have a very, very regimented warm up and preparations. And so, is it even important? Question mark. I don't know. But I think, like you said earlier, anytime you're working with a pro athlete, you always want to err on the the ultra cautious side to not negatively impact performance. And that's reasonably so, because it does have some impacts on performance immediately after, and especially when they're done longer, as we've talked about. So it's an interesting area to look at. So let's talk about, unless you have something else to add on that, Katja, I think we can move on to what is what is actually stretching? There's been some interesting research on what's actually stretching, and I think taking a peek into that next will be good.
Yeah. So when you look at a lot of the stretching literature, you will find many, many studies that look at how does the muscle stretch, or then sometimes how does the tendon stretch, and studies looking at the specifics of those tissues. And very recently, there has been a study, or it's also kind of like a narrative review by Carla Stecco. And if you've listened along in this podcast, particularly the discussions around fascia, you will have heard Carla Stecco's name, who is really a very prominent fascia researcher from Padua in Italy. And she did ask the question in that review, what are we stretching? Are we stretching muscle, or are we stretching tendon, or are we stretching fascia? And fascia, how she terms it in that paper, would include any like big fascial sheets, like the plantar fascia or the thoracolumbar fascia, and then also all the fascia that is surrounding and impenetrating your muscles. That would be what she understands as fascia in that study. And it's really interesting because when we think about stretching and we talk about stretching, we often have the muscles in mind, but you can look at so-called strain curves of those tissues. So they will tell you something about how much they give when you stretch. So how easily do they elongate when you stretch? And when you look at those numbers, you will find that muscles give way quite easily. So you stretch, but they will elongate rather easily. So it's quite likely that that's not the first mm, hindrance that you notice when you do a stretch. So the muscle, as it elongates when you do stretch, won't be that that part of the body that will give you that sensation of stretch. Now, if we look at tendons, they have a very different number. When we look at that, they only can elongate about 4% until you will find micro ruptures in them. So they actually get injured if you stretch a tendon more than 4% of its length. As a contrast, the muscles I just mentioned, depending on what muscles you're looking at, they can give way up to 75% of their length. So very, very different capacity there. A tendon would injure itself a lot earlier. But what's interesting again is that those two types of tissues, they are in the body in form, they're in a series. So you have tendon, muscle, and then you have the tendon again that attaches the muscle to other tissues. So as the two of them work together in sync or work as one unit, the tendon will probably not be that first element of resistance either, because the muscle just gives way so much. So instead, it's quite likely that it's actually those other fascial tissues that I just mentioned, thoracolumbar fascia, those aponeurosis, and also the fascial tissues that surround and impenetrate your muscles, that they are that first resistance that you notice in a stretch. And I've mentioned 4% for the tendon and up to 75% for the muscle. For the fascial tissues, that would be, I think it was 27% in that study.
Mm.
So, and they are not in series like the tendon and the muscle, but more, you can imagine, more in parallel in terms of their architecture. So what you probably notice when you notice that first resistance in a stretch is quite likely your fascial tissues, meaning the intramuscular fascia, and then also those aponeuroses like the thoracolumbar fascia or the plantar fascia. Those are prominent ones that people know, that will give you that sense of restriction or sense of stretch when you're in a static stretch.
So I love this analogy. I forget who I heard this from first, but it was such a great way to wrap your head around this for me. Was the imagine if you had like one of those really thick rubber bands, or maybe two of them, and then a really thin, flimsy rubber band. and you tie the two thick rubber bands to the ends of the thin one, that would be like the muscle with the tendon. So you can imagine if you were to pull on it, those thick rubber bands aren't going to move at all, but that flimsy one is going to take up a lot of that movement that's happening. And so you kind of have this visual of how the fascia is kind of one of the first tissues to feel that stretch as we take it to the range of motion, because the tendons are so thick and strong and fibrous. Like you said, they only stretch about the amount is so small, that 4% versus the 70% or the 20, what did you say, 22%,
27,
20,
I think.
27%. And so you get a nice picture of it. And now also consider that the fascia is wrapping around the muscle. It's running through the different layers of muscle cells and bundles of cells. And so you have this kind of fascia enwrapped and encasing the muscle, but also each of the layers of the muscle. And I think it's an important one just to kind of keep in mind and have that visual of what's happening. And this is from, I just want to mention the study so you can find it. It's just called Fascial or Muscle Stretching, question mark, a narrative review. And again, that was Carla Stecco, who's done a lot of great research on fascia too, but really looking at how the different layers are affected differently. It's so hard to stretch. It's challenging to stretch a tendon. Do we need to stretch one? Like, that's the question. If we can't stretch it, do we need to stretch it? Is it made to stretch? Should it stretch? So many wonderful questions.
Yeah. And then also this one, I think primarily looked at the tissues in the leg, so plantar fascia and the fascia of the crural fascia on the back of your lower leg. So I'm really excited in the future to see other studies that will look more at other body parts, the upper extremity, the back, and so on. So we still don't know many of these things. And I think it's very important that this discussion finds its way into the stretching literature. I mean, obviously, because I'm a fascia nerd. But if you look at older studies, you will mainly find that discussion around the muscles and around the tendons. So I think that bit of information really progresses our thought about stretching and about the biomechanics of it, but also potential physiological mechanisms behind it.
Mhm.
So I do really hope that we find or will find more of that in the studies to come.
And that transition, I know in my functional anatomy course, we talk a lot about the microscopic elements of the anatomical continuum, which, we talk about muscles as separate parts, but it really is this continuum, like you're starting to talk about, in this transition from less dense tissue to more dense connective tissue, from fascia to tendon to cartilage to bone, and how each of those is so important for transmitting force and all of their so many important functions. So I think it's important just to kind of have a little bit of that visual of what's happening. So we know that when we're doing these, especially the static stretches, and there's some interesting research on some of these other modalities we've talked about, that we are probably mostly influencing that fascia. That's probably the target tissue. And as a yoga teacher, I'm always asking too, when you're doing a yin pose, especially if you're looking to influence range of motion or even a meridian, an energetic tissue, I do want to know where they feel it if I have a target tissue in mind, whether that be to work on range of motion for their hamstrings or work on the bladder meridian or whatever that might be. I have a goal. That's my target tissue. And I need to make sure that that's where they feel it. And a lot of times that fascial stretch, we feel kind of more as a continuum through the muscle, though you might feel it in one area more than the other. Versus, and we all know this, a lot of yoga people know this, feeling the stretch in the tendon at the sitting bone or behind the knees. We're really looking for that stretch through the belly and the fascial tissue that is made to stretch, that is made to do that. So, I think it kind of backs up a lot of our traditional cues that we use and ways of talking about these things as we start to understand that, hey, not only is that what's stretching, but that's probably also the important thing to target too, rather than the tendinous tissue, which is not made to stretch much. So when you're feeling those stretches at the sitting bones and the tendons, or in the tendons behind the knee for the hamstrings we're talking about, I probably just want to adjust. And if you're a really flexible person, maybe I just don't need that stretch. maybe those fascial tissues are maxed out, and like now my tendons are feeling some of that. Who knows? We can develop a lot of different theories. I don't necessarily need to talk that story all the way through, but I want to be able to find a way either to back off or find a different pose or grab some props or do something to kind of feel it along that continuum in some way. In some way, it might not be the full belly of the muscle, but less focused around that tendon. So there's other elements too that I think are really interesting as we talk about stretching. We know that the fascial tissue can be a limiting factor, but there's also been some really interesting, really new research too around how the nervous system limits stretching. And I know, in the yoga world, it has kind of gone around this idea of allowing the nerves to kind of relax into and get used to stretching, this kind of desensitization that happens as we allow our bodies to stay. But there's some other interesting research too around nerves and stretching that's popped up, that I think is important to mention here as well.
Yeah, and that's more on the side of the mechanical aspects of nerves, so not about the central nervous system and how we kind of ease into that stretch, but the actual mechanical resistance that a nerve has in a stretch. And there is some interesting work on the sciatic nerve. So we kind of talk about the back of the leg today a lot, but it fits there too. So the sciatic nerve, for instance, has been proven to limit range of motion, for instance, in Paschimottanasana, in stretches like that. And I mean, we could argue, is it the nerve only, or may the fascia surrounding the nerve not play a role? Also, you have to keep in mind that a nerve also has this fascial encasing, and how it slides and glides within that casing will be relevant. So has a little bit to do with fascia at least also, but the nerve per se and how that is situated in the surrounding tissues can also limit your range of motion. And interestingly, especially that holds true as we grow older. So that has been shown for older people even more so than for younger people, which I find interesting. I love anything that shows us that our bodies, and then also of course our yoga practice, evolves with us and changes throughout our lifespan, and it never gets boring, and we may target our stretches or our body regions a little bit differently as we mature and as we get older. So I think that's also something to keep in mind generally, but specifically also as we talk about the nerves and their mechanical resistance they can pose in a stretch.
And I know people are gonna be wondering, like, what was the age cutoff? Because I know I was it's like, where? Because everyone's version of older is very different. Some people I know our 20-year-old daughter thinks that 40 is older, and, everyone has a different view of that, but in this study, so they had the younger participants were around 22 years old, I think plus or minus 1 year, and then the older population was 72 plus or minus 5 years. So, really looking at a very clear distinction between what it means to stretch and have more fascial limitations, probably when we're in a much younger phase of our life, a very different phase of our life in our 20s, our early 20s versus early 70s. And maybe this new idea of maybe the limiting factor is really more nerve tissue rather than fascial tissue, which kind of makes sense because we know that as we get older, especially, 70s and beyond, that there are commonly significant muscular changes that are happening too. And even though we're talking about fascia, remember fascia is enwrapping that muscular structure. So they're kind of a team. They're definitely going to be influenced, but really, what we're looking at is just this idea that when it comes to range of motion, that in this older population, maybe part of that is working on the nerve tissue. And I know we talk about this a lot in the nervous system teacher training with our yoga medicine teachers is the importance of working with the nerve tissue, whether that's stretching or flossing. To be able to target that nerve tissue is such a powerful therapeutic modality. Maybe we'll have another episode on it. There's so many more episodes to come. So many great topics. But I think such a really interesting point when we talked about range of motion specifically, which is kind of the focus of this episode.
Yeah, and I think one more thing I want to throw in here, that maybe more relates to aging than the nerves per se. But there are so many things that we can consider. For instance, also as we age, there might be more inflammatory, silent inflammatory processes going on, and then that may affect, for instance, your pH level, and that may affect then again your fascial tissues, because it will have some effect on some of the building blocks of your fascial tissues. So the whole physiology around it is so complex, and also there is so much more to learn when we look at all those mechanisms. And we just or mainly talked about range of motion today, and there are so many theories out there, and you can really get lost in them. So that's also my shout out to not get lost in them when you pull up some of that research, but to really, stick with a couple of those takeaways and experiment with them, and be really um, yeah, open towards new ideas, because it's quite likely that in a couple of years we
Mhm.
will have again new knowledge and new insights into all of those specifics, especially as it comes to, again, the nerves, for instance, because they also have been research for the lower body, and we will have to find out. And I believe there are actually people who are currently looking at this in the upper extremity and the upper body. So, yeah, not only so many more podcasts or podcast episodes to come, but also a
Research.
lot of exciting research on the way, and hopefully on the way too, that we would look forward to.
Yeah, I think it's a great reminder, and it's kind of part of our mission with this podcast is to continue to remember that it's not just about the research. Like, we have to keep applying what we know from research, the things that we really do know, but even then we know that those things can change. So we have to stay open to our experiences and our students' experiences, because that ultimately is the truth for our body in that moment. There's so many moving parts when we talk about outcomes from research experiments as well. But then we talk about working one-on-one with therapeutic clients, or maybe working, if you're a student, working with yourself and your own health and wellness. We have to be open to listening. And it's one of the reasons why I think yoga is really the foundation to all of our healthcare experiences, because it allows us to be inquisitive, it allows us to take note, it allows us to listen and be able to adapt, which is ultimately the importance of finding balance and health. Is I have to be able to listen and adapt, and I can't find all of that information in a research study, and I don't think you ever will be able to, because we're not robots, we're not all made the same. And so we are being influenced by our environments, our genetics, our everything we put into our body, everything we take out of our body. And so just important to keep in mind. I think these are great pieces of information that give us something to work with. And I love, you mentioned it a couple times now too, which was kind of one that I wanted to make sure we kind of bookmarked, was the work of Helene Langevin. And if you haven't watched it yet, I know you pronounce that differently than I do. You probably have a better pronunciation, but she has some great videos. If you look her up on stretching, she has one in particular that I'm thinking of. I think it's about a half an hour. And she talks about the research that she's done, really looking at how these longer, and I think a lot of her stretches in her research are like 10 to 20 minutes long. So it doesn't totally relate to what we do. We still have yet to look at how much that applies to like a 2 or 5 minute stretch in maybe a yin practice, but a lot of really powerful implications for influencing inflammation. That's huge. Like, do I need to say any more? And fibrosis, or these kind of adhesions that can develop between the tissues there. And then we also know from research too that maybe these held stretches are influencing the hydration of the connective tissue potentially. Again, I think there's more to learn on all of those before we can make some really decisive conclusions. But her research has been very powerful and strong in pointing a finger to that anti-inflammatory and anti-fibrotic effect with these held static stretches. And I think most or all of her research is in animals. I'm not sure if you have details, but most of the research I've seen of hers was with animals. So, I mean, there's a lot still to learn, but there's some strong suggestions here. And important because we are focusing on range of motion in this episode, that there are a lot of other a lot of other, and I think we all have experienced the other as, the influences on the parasympathetic nervous system, the relaxation response that comes as we target with some of those nerve endings with the held stretches. Um, but let's move into one more quick topic, which we're going to try not to dive into too deeply because I think we need to do probably whole episodes on this. But with myofascial release, as it relates to range of motion, specifically, in this topic we're talking about of stretching, you want to give us some of the summaries there?
Yeah. So also for myofascial release, there have been a couple of really good reviews in the couple of years. So they're very recent and they sum up the many, many studies that have come up the last couple of years. And what they tell us is that, especially in the short term, myofascial release also leads to those acute increases in range of motion. They are comparable to stretching interventions. So just a short bout of myofascial release can also lead to quite a big improvement in range of motion. And at the same time, we know from these reviews that the detrimental effects on performance are also really minor. Again, when we think about high end athletes or professional athletes, those minor effects might be relevant nonetheless. So keep that in mind. But generally, you have very good acute effects on range of motion comparable to stretching without detrimental effects, or mainly without detrimental effects. In some cases, even a little bit of positive effects. So that really is a great information too, because you can mix it up in your warm up, for instance, as we going back to that idea of athletes and doing stretches or doing different modalities as a warm up, active cardio stuff, maybe dynamic stretches, maybe a shorter static stretch. You can also throw in some myofascial release if you're looking for all of that. And you can, of course, also use myofascial release after a workout or after your yoga practice if you want to work on range of motion. But it has definitely proven to lead to improvements in range of motion if you're looking for that.
And I think everyone who's done some myofascial release, we do so much of it at yoga medicine, and it really doesn't take a lot of experience with myofascial release to really experience that firsthand. You feel it really quickly, and especially in areas that are maybe more limited or more challenging for you. I love using myofascial release because it gives that quick effects on range of motion. However, when we look at PNF as well as MFR, we both of these are great modalities for that acute short-term change where we have that very quick, like I mentioned in Baddha Konasana with the PNF or with the MFR really anywhere, we get that acute short-term change in our range of motion that's so helpful. However, it's probably only lasting a very short period of time. And so we have to be able to capture that and then put it into some movement where maybe that's active range of motion or dynamic movements or sports preparations or in my sport specifically. And then, of course, with MFR, we know that there can be some cumulative effect because we're changing now how the tissue is, the matrix is being rebuilt. If we're doing it regularly over time, we can have some cumulative effects, which I don't think is really the case so much with PNF. Um, Although with PNF, what we tend to do is use it before static stretching. So if we're using it before static stretching, we're using the static stretching regularly. We know that there are some long-term range of motion changes that are happening, i.e., the study on 5 minutes a week, 1 minute, 5 days a week. That was important. So such a great, again, we could talk about MFR for a long time, but such a great way to acutely influence range of motion, not have those performance deficits, and again, wanting to do it right before. I don't know, what's your understanding of the research on how long those changes last? I've seen a lot of variations in, the effects of myofascial release maybe being 20 minutes or an hour or two.
I
What's your
think the longest study I have seen looked again after an hour, but most of them, as with many stretching studies, really look a couple minutes after the intervention. So that's one of the limitations of stretching and also of MFR research, that they typically look at the short term stuff. So meaning you do your stretch, you do your myofascial release, and then after a couple minutes, the examiner comes in again and remeasures your range of motion, for instance. And typically, yeah, that's 3 to maybe 15 minutes. That's, I would say, what probably most studies cover. Some of them go a bit longer, but pretty much none of them do another follow up a day later or a month later, which is also really complicated to do when it comes to research design. So, of course, if you do that a day later or a month later, the person will have done so many other things in the meantime as well. So you cannot really say for sure what may have led to a change of the outcome you're looking at. So, long story short, your question was, what
But
about
in
how long do they typically look? Typically, they look a couple minutes after the
well, no,
intervention, and that would be considered acute.
how long does it last, right? So, the effects on range of motion, I think with MFR, a lot of those acute effects are wearing off. So, if you're using it with an athlete, it's really important that you're doing it right before they go into the warm ups or their training. A lot of athletes will do it within their warm up, and so, unless I'm using that range of motion, it's going to dissipate. Those effects are going to dissipate pretty quickly. Maybe that's 15 or 20 minutes. Maybe that's an hour. We still have
Yeah.
more to learn, I think, on the specifics of that, but it is short term. Now, again, any of these fascial techniques that we're doing regularly over time will influence how that matrix is rebuilt because it's like most tissues in the body that it's turning over. And so, there can be cumulative effects, but for the most part, a lot of those effects are fairly short term. So, MFR, great way to increase range of motion acutely short term, minor effects on performance and sometimes positive effects on performance. Great in a warm up, also great for recovery. There's a lot more I think we could talk about for myofascial release. There's been some good information on its use in recovery for other reasons. So many great uses for athletes. I know we talk about it a lot in the athlete training that we run. And, I think all of these are so important when you talk about working with athletes. And we spend a lot of time talking about this in the training is how do I support athletes at different phases of their training cycle or their training day? With a pro athlete, they have a full day of training. And with, maybe a high school athlete or someone else, it's going to be very different. And so what I love about yoga is that there are so many different tools. It's not just static stretching versus, myofascial release versus some of the few things we've done, but there's a whole continuum of how I can apply these resources depending on where a person's at in their training cycle, depending on their needs or their injuries or previous injuries or limitations. I think for static stretching prior to sports, I'm not using that with an athlete usually unless there are some range of motion limitations that are impacting their performance. And I'm usually using MFR, especially with athletes, because one, because athletes tend to love it and they kind of have a negative bias towards stretching, but also because with the MFR, it is really great for acute outcomes. I know I personally like to save the static stretching for after, and that's kind of traditionally how we do it in yoga at the end of a practice. Though, I don't think it's out of the question to use it at the beginning of a practice too. If you're going to do a whole practice on hamstrings, maybe you even have a forward fold briefly at the beginning just to create a relationship and awareness with them, or maybe to present a challenge to them to rise to the occasion. Or, maybe there's other reasons, but I think knowing your purpose is really the important part, whether that's working with athletes or whether that's teaching group classes. There's a lot of different ways we can integrate this information and research too in a lot of different
Yeah.
contexts.
And a couple sentences ago, you used one word. You said whole. There's a whole range of things that we can do. And obviously, there's a whole range of purposes that a person may come to stretching or MFR. And I think what is so important about yoga, or what I love about yoga in that context, is that it provides that space to go on that whole body exploration too. So we, in this podcast episode, we kind of tried to explain some of the building blocks, and there are so many, and we can get lost in any one of them. But as you already previously today described, there is space in yoga and there is the room in yoga to really tune in and to listen to what the stretch or what the MFR intervention does in your body, and not only in the hamstrings or in the foot or in the shoulder, but on a complete or whole body level. And then it's maybe not even that important if that stems from the nervous system or from a biomechanical mechanism or from an inflammatory mechanism, but we provide the space to explore the effects in your own body and as a whole. And I think that is something that we, especially after talking about the tidbits and the tiny things and all the building blocks, we need to keep in mind as well that yoga is just very special that way. It's one of the disciplines where we can bring all of these things together. And it's important to understand some of the specifics, but in the end, yoga is really special too, because we don't have to go into the specifics and make it too complicated all the time, but we provide that playground to really explore your whole body or your whole system in there.
Hmm. Well said. And I love that you said special. Special made me think about one last research article that I think wasn't really on our list, but I just thought of that I wanted to add here because it really is special. It probably deserves an episode of its own because it's so big. But I loved this research that came out on the efficacy of stretching. It's called the efficacy of stretching exercises on arterial stiffness in middle-aged and older adults. And I won't go into the details of it, but it opens up a whole nother can of worms of like, what are some of the other potentials? And this study was looking at middle and older adults, middle-aged and older adults. So I think middle-aged was like starting 40s, 50s, and then older adults was 70s and 80s or something around there, close to that. And I think it's important as we start to think about, middle-aged and older age adults, the number one killer, within, that has been for a very long time now is cardiovascular diseases. And so this brings to light another interesting use that I don't think was on anyone's radar, and its effects on arterial stiffness, a very specific, again, a meta-analysis looking at, a whole bunch of different studies to give us a really good spotlight on, hey, maybe stretching isn't just for range of motion. Maybe it isn't just for anti-inflammatories or anti-fibrotic or for relaxation or the nervous system or for the meridians or energetics or a million other things we could look at, but maybe it's even for the health of the cardiovascular system. I think that's a pretty huge thing. I know it definitely stuck in my mind for a long time. So there's a lot of uses, we've really focused more on range of motion, but I think when we think about stretching and range of motion, it really just kind of is the tip of the iceberg of all of the uses that we can have for stretching. And also this idea we looked at in the with Rachel, I talked about how much range of motion do we really need? And we talked about hip mobility and, how much do we actually need? Which is another great question as we're talking about stretches. And when we talk about athletes, I think there's still a lot we can learn about exactly how and when to use it with athletes, but that's the name of the game with professional athletics is everyone has their own mix and assortment of things that makes their sport special, their their competitive side special. So the specific mix, like you said, is applying that mindfulness and skillfulness of a yoga practitioner to listen and observe to be able to find what works for the athletes, and obviously depends on their training cycle. Gentle stretching can be a great way to recover as well. I always like to use it personally at the end of a training day with athletes or on a recovery day potentially for athletes because of the nervous system effects as well. But we've got lots of different effects, whether that's for range of motion or arterial stiffness or connective tissue or stress or parasympathetic central nervous system regulation, um, neurologic regulation too, and our ability to be comfortable in these stretching positions and relax in them. So there's so many different applications. I always get a little bit sad when one, when people boil yoga down to just stretching, because I think there's so much more to it. Even just stretching, there's so much more to it. Um, but I also think get really sad when people throw stretching out the window, which I'm so glad to see in sports medicine stretching coming back into play, because there are so many great uses. I think when we use it is such a challenging one, to figure out for the person. Is it At the end of the day, I always like to think of this like shutting down your computer versus yanking the cord out of the wall. That importance of recovery for an athlete. A cool down period is so important, whether that be with stretching or myofascial release or other modalities. We talked about MFR using it prior to their training sessions, and then maybe even following it up with some active range of motion, so that not only am I gaining that range of motion or mobility, but now I'm able to control it and use that range of motion, which is really the helpful part of it, and transitioning that into their warm up or their training. Or am I using it on a recovery day to enhance recovery? Am I using it at the end of the training day? Am I using it during a yoga practice to challenge the tissues, like in the middle of the practice? Or am I using it at the end of the practice to shut down the computer and the systems? I think all of these are great options. And I really think that there's rarely a right or a wrong, but knowing my purpose and listening and adapting in response to my body how my body responds to that is so important, and really is the crux of what we do at yoga that makes it yoga and not just stretching. Because we use this term stretching a lot in research, because you can grab so much research that applies to yoga through this word stretching. But in yoga, I think there really is a difference between stretching you would do probably in an athletic fitness realm versus what we do in a yoga realm, which usually involves maybe a little bit more mindfulness, skillfulness, other techniques potentially. Yeah. What are your final thoughts, Katya?
I think my final thought is that research, and also we today in our discussion, is really mainly focusing on the musculoskeletal system and stretching still. And there's so much interesting stuff in there. But for me, the highlights really are the things that we just kind of bookmarked or looked at really quickly. It's a whole system thing, and we're only starting to learn all of these other aspects, be it on the nervous system, on the endocrine system too, which we haven't talked about, on the nervous system, I said already, on inflammation and the immune system, on the cardiovascular system. So there is, I think, so much more to it that is just emerging. And I think it would be a waste to reduce stretching to only look at range of motion, but there is so much to it and so many facets to it and so many layers to it that we will learn about more in the future. And that's what I really love about it, is that we keep learning that it's a whole system thing. And yeah, that's something that we should keep in mind, I think. Not just the range of motion, although that's very interesting, many, many, many aspects that we can benefit from.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the applications really kind of depend on the circumstance and the context. However, we talked a bit about nerves and stretching, and I think that there's a lot of the tenets of yoga philosophy that really create the underpinnings, um, not only that bring it into a yoga context, but that I think are really applicable to stretching. This ability to have the patience to stay and listen, right? In these held static stretches, it can be so challenging to just be still there, but to stay and listen and allow the nerves to become accustomed to that range of motion. So we start to build that nervous system resilience, our ability to investigate and self-study, which is so important. Again, that curiosity to stay and notice, but also to be nonviolent, not have to push ourselves in as deep as we possibly can, but be able to just kind of gently fold into the stretch until we feel some of that resistance of the tissues. And how do we make a relationship with it and welcome what we find and investigate and stay and do the self study to listen and not be greedy and to find some truthfulness there. Like, what do I really need? For those of you who are really flexible, do I need more range of motion here? Maybe, maybe not. For those who are tighter, what do I really need? Or same question, do I need more range of motion, or do I need to just find a way to relax here and find my own shape? Because there's so much more we talked about in the mobility episode, the hip mobility episode, that is beyond, out of our hands here. Our bony structure and our tissues are so different from person to person. So I love that these philosophical underpinnings of yoga become so relevant when we look at these practices and really are what kind of brings some of the depth and context to how do we use it? How do we apply it? Which in some ways I think is more important than are we staying for 1 minute or 5 minutes? I do think there are some different usages within that context. Again, whether it's range of motion or inflammation or something in the something else. But I do think how we apply it, that ability to be patient and relax and stay and be not be greedy are so important and be truthful with ourselves and kind of brings it full circle for the preciousness that it holds in a yoga setting, which, we spent so much of the episode just talking about range of motion. Like you said, there's so much more to it. It's not just for range of motion, but it can be used in a lot of different ways. So I hope that this has shed some light. I mean, there's a lot more. There's a ton of research out there, but this really gives a really good overview of some of the big, robust reviews and information that we have as of now. And maybe we'll talk again in 5 or 10 years. Oh, well, thank you so much, Katya. It's been a great conversation. I love talking about the stretching and the applications. So many great takeaways.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. We will see you guys next time. Enjoy your day. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.